Welcome to another episode of the Reboot Chronicles, a no-holds-barred forum with global leaders, authors, entrepreneurs, and CEOs about how organizations stay focused on growth and innovation in unprecedented times. I'm your host, Dean Tobias, coming to you live from Reviv's North American headquarters in Chicago, and we would like to thank you for joining us from around the globe today. I'd like to welcome Jason Feifer to the Reboot Chronicles. He is an inspiring leader, editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Magazine, host of 2 podcasts, as well as author of a new book that I really like called Build for Tomorrow, an action plan for embracing change, adapting fast, and future-proofing your career. Jason, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You're looking good there.
Thank you. Yeah,
those of you that
I try to dress up for the occasion.
Yeah, those of you that aren't on the video version of this, I see a Colorado T-shirt, which I just came back from.
Ah, nice. A big focus of mine, which is the focus of the book, which is Build for Tomorrow, and also the work I just do every day at Entrepreneur Magazine is really focused on change, how people navigate change. And Colorado represents a massive change to me because that is where we relocated, my family and I, during the pandemic. The day schools shut down in New York City, which is where we live, we went out to my parents' place because they have a house where there was room for 2 small boys to run around. Instead of the apartment that we were in. So anyway, we were in Colorado for what turned out to be 18 months. So it was a massive, massive change and
culture shift there.
Shifted the way that I think about everything.
Yeah, those that have been following the podcast for years know I moved out to Colorado as well during it, so we did a lot of recordings from there, different studio, and great place to be. But Entrepreneur Magazine, gosh, it's been around since the 70s. I think I was one of your early subscribers. I couldn't I literally couldn't get enough of it in college. And no, 70s, sorry, high school. So I probably got into it in the 80s during college. Yeah, and you guys have come a long way. This is a media platform. Can you give us just the short version? What's going on these days with the platform you have?
Sure. So Entrepreneur is around for 40-something years. Wow. It is not my company, to be clear.
I know.
It is the Shea family's company, but I've been the editor-in-chief since 2016, and I joined the company a year before that as executive editor of the magazine.
So it was a great move on their part.
And a great move on my part. It's been really great. And the major shift, I would say, that we have undergone, aside from just the normal media, you have to be really nimble, you have to meet your audience where they are. There's a million different ways to do that. The major shift for a brand called Entrepreneur is that, for the 40-something years that Entrepreneur has been around, the word entrepreneur, to the degree that anybody had ever heard it, let alone knew how to spell it, it meant something very specific. And now it doesn't. Now the word entrepreneur is something that many different kinds of people doing many different kinds of work all carry around as a badge of honor. And when I came on as editor-in-chief, said, we really need to start thinking about how to speak to people culturally,
right,
and understand how to be relevant to everybody who identifies as an entrepreneur. And that has been a real project, but also an incredibly exciting one because it takes us into territory beyond the nuts and bolts of business building and into things like mindset and self-worth and understanding and mission and purpose and all this stuff that I think is just equally important for entrepreneurs as they try to do the impossible.
Yeah, well said. Of the many things I do, you and I advise a lot of startups and do speaking and too many podcasts, but my most fun stuff is teaching MBAs how not to go into the corporate world and get them to understand the power of where you can actually do 1 or 2 things, but giving them that taste of entrepreneurship or any kind of entrepreneurial environment, even if it's volunteer, is so important. Unfortunately, they're almost like 30 at that point, but exposing our children to it at an early age, I think is just a really smart thing. But back to the magazines, I also remember reading Ink back then, and you're right. People would like, what are you reading? I'm like, I don't know, but I really like it. And I don't like all this corporate stuff you're training me on in college. How do you, I just feel like some people get your 2 platforms confused. How do you compare the 2?
Yeah, it's understandable because we're operating in the same space, and I can speak a lot more for Entrepreneur than I can for Ink. Just to be clear on that, so I'll really speak to Entrepreneur and not to Ink. I'll let the team over there define themselves. But for what it's worth, I actually used to work at Fast Company. I was an
Yes,
editor
I
of Fast
remember.
Company,
Yeah.
and Fast Company and Inc. are the same parent company, Mansueto Ventures. So I got to see some of it up close. But the way that Entrepreneur thinks of itself is that we are not a magazine about business. We're a magazine about thinking, because that is ultimately the core of business. And business, I think of as a very human pursuit. So I want Entrepreneur to distinguish itself by speaking to the thing that all entrepreneurs have in common, which is the experience of entrepreneurship, of feeling lonely and crazy and problem solving your way through walls. And we can help you with marketing strategies, but we can also help you by just creating, and this is the thing that excites me the most, is creating a place where people feel comfortable sharing failures and struggles and what they learned as a result. Because the craziest thing about entrepreneurship is that people feel very alone together. It is a shared aloneness, because it can feel very isolating, and it's so helpful to hear from other people who are going through that kind of thing. And when I was, again, I can't speak to Inc. When I was at Fast Company, which was a long time ago under different editor in chief, so I can't really speak to what Fast Company is like now. But Fast Company at the time was very much a magazine about big companies and success and how people are making major changes in industries. And I'll be honest, I didn't find that all that interesting,
Yeah.
because
You
it
guys were
felt
on
like
fire then, but yeah, everything was good news. You didn't hear the backstory.
everything. Yeah, it just felt like a lot of repeating of a polished story that somebody came up
Yeah.
with in a room. And I'm not interested in that. I'm really interested in sitting down with people who are going to lay bare what they're going through
I love it.
for the sole purpose of helping others. And that's what I hope distinguishes Entrepreneur.
I love it. Can you give us a scrappy story of someone that really had some challenging setbacks? Could even be yourself, but you've got so many stories. We'll get into the book in a bit, but of that really did overcome that, and what people can learn from that. Because you're right, the glossy ones I don't think are very helpful either.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I got a million of them. I'll tell you one that I've been thinking about for years, which is saw the story of this guy named Sam who started Dogfish, which is a brewery in Delaware. And I was walking around his brewery with him years ago, and he told me this story, which blew my mind, which was that at the early days of the company, he had released this beer called 90 Minute IPA, very, very strong, 9% alcohol by volume, India Pale Ale, which 9%, if you don't know, is just like, that'll just knock you on the floor. And
Yeah.
his distributor said, this is a tasty beer. People like it, but can you make a version people can, drink standing up? And so he makes 6% alcohol version, which he calls 60 Minute IPA. And this is at the very beginning of what turned out to be a real roaring time for IPAs in the beer industry. People just
Yeah.
really loved IPAs. And this thing just took off. It very quickly was on track to become 75 to 80% of all sales of Dogfish, this one beer. And most people would think, well, that is exactly what we want in business. We want to create a hit product, and we want to try to sell as much of it as we possibly can. And so what I was fascinated by was Sam's response to this, because Sam's response to this is a gigantic problem. And the problem is that tastes are going to change, because no one style of beer is going to be popular forever. And therefore, if he allows his company to be dominated by this one product, so that every time someone walks into a restaurant or a liquor store or whatever, they encounter 60 Minute IPA by Dogfish, well, then they're going to think of him as a hot IPA brand until IPAs aren't as hot anymore. And then they're going to think of him as an old brand, and that's death. So his solution is to cap sales of his best-selling product at 50%. Now, I understand that sometimes companies will create a kind of false scarcity for increased demand, but that's not really what he's doing here. What he's doing isn't trying to hype up his product. What he's doing is really trying to not let his product define his company. And this means that people are furious at him. I mean, he told me people were screaming at him on the streets of Delaware. I've walked around Delaware with Sam. Sam is Beyonce in Delaware.
Yeah.
I've taken selfies with him. And so, but I asked, were you ever concerned that this was the wrong decision? And he said, no, because I didn't have another choice. This would have ruined the company. And number two, I saw it as an education opportunity. So whenever people reached out and said, I'd like to carry 60-minute IPA. He would say, I'm really sorry. Demand is very high. We're trying to keep up with it, which is basically a lie, and because they could have kept up with it. And in the meantime, why don't you try some of our other styles of beer? Why don't you try our Saison? Why don't you try our pumpkin ale? And this is how he gets the full range of his beers into stores and becomes known as an innovative brand rather than as an IPA
Or a
brand.
one-hit
And
wonder, yeah.
that's exactly. And that's how he sold that company for $300 million a few years
I was
ago.
wondering why they
You
got such a
don't
good valuation.
I mean, I would attribute,
What a
I'm
great
sure Sam
lesson.
would
Oh my gosh.
give you a more complicated answer. Yeah. And so the lesson that I take away from it is you have to change before you must. You cannot wait for something to come along and force you to change, because at that time, at that point, you must scramble and you're going to make decisions that are driven by trying to reduce pain rather than what you should be doing, which is making decisions about what is best for the long-term interests of your company.
Yeah, well said. And it's like you have to balance, one hit wonder versus a portfolio. But it's like most coaches will say you got to focus, just do one thing. But he got to a point where he must have talked to someone because it was brilliant advice. Like, no, you've got to
It
have
was
a platform of things that you're gonna, because anyone can knock it off right away. It's like boom, ours is better.
Yeah, that's right. And, you could argue that what he did was focus, but he just focused on something
It was
different. Instead of focusing on the sale of that product, he focused on the deep purpose of the company, which was to be an innovative leader in beer. And if you're thinking of it that way,
yep.
and that's your focus, well, then it's very clear what you have to do in this circumstance.
Yeah, yeah, um, yeah. Well said. The let's talk about you a little bit.
Sure.
By the way, I loved your comment about alone together on entrepreneurs. It's like I think that's a song, David. Yeah, I'll come to you in a minute,
It's like
but
it's
that's
like bowling alone.
yeah, it's exactly. So, you're now doing two podcasts, and
Mhm.
so I'm just curious, how do you keep things straight? I'm asking for a friend, of course, because it's hard enough running
Yeah.
one podcast. What's going on there?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the two podcasts are that I do one for Entrepreneur, which is called Problem Solvers, and then I do one called Help Wanted, which is part of a small but mighty podcast network that I'm helping to build with some friends. Nicole Lappin, who's a best-selling
Yeah, she's good.
personal
Yep.
finance author. Yeah, she's fantastic, and Morgan Lavoie, who is her editor in chief there, and so I'm an advisor to that company, and it's been an absolute blast. And the reason I do those shows, look, one podcast is plenty, believe me. And there was a time where I was doing three, but I have this belief, and the belief is that time expands under pressure. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So, first of all, for context, in addition to being editor in chief of Entrepreneur and then hosting these two podcasts, I also travel quite a lot for speaking. I do some startup advising, as we had talked about.
Yep.
I have a couple other projects, wrote this book. So, I'm doing a lot. And how do I do it? Well, people often say, if I said to you, listener, I said, you should start a podcast, the first thing that you might think of is, well, I don't have the time for that. And the logic of I don't have the time for that is that there might be some opposing moment in which you did have the time for it, in which every Wednesday from 2 to 4 p.m. it was just like open space. But of course, that's literally never what your life is going to be like because of Parkinson's law. Parkinson's law states that work expands to fit the time allotted. So whatever work you have, it will fill the time that you have.
Right.
So saying I don't have the time for it will mean that you'll never, ever have the time for it. So instead, I like to think of it this way. It's kind of like time is like a balloon. So, you don't say in the same way that you would say, well, I don't have the time for it. I need to make the time for it. I wish I had time for it. You don't say that the way to fill a balloon is by expanding the balloon so that air can fit in. Right? You don't expand a balloon and then fit air in. It doesn't work like that. Instead, you blow air into the balloon and then it expands. A balloon expands under pressure. Time expands under pressure too, which is to say that if you take on something new, what it will do is force you to more strongly consider everything else that you're doing. Am I doing this for a purpose? Is this project still helping me?
Right.
Am I being as efficient as possible in the way that I do this? It will start to force hard decisions. It will start to force you to prioritize in ways that, frankly, you might not have otherwise done if not forced to. I found that every time that I take something on, yes, there is a transition period where I'm like, what did I just do? But ultimately, ultimately, I'm happier as a result because it forced me to make hard decisions about what maybe I've been doing for a while that I need to stop doing,
Yeah.
or about how maybe it's time to just spend a little money on somebody who can help me on this thing so that I'm not doing all the nitty-gritty myself that I shouldn't be doing. And that's how I do those things.
Yeah,
Time expands under pressure.
and it's great advice just for any entrepreneur or writing a book or whatever, or me. I thought you were talking about me there for a second. It's crazy. I have this simple checkbox list or Venn diagram if I'm teaching at Kellogg, because we love those. It's like fun, money, and impact. And if I'm not doing a couple of those, I have to take a pass at it. But
Mm,
I don't take passes on too many things, and it's a problem. The balloon only gets so large, and then so you started out the second podcast as really an extension of the new book, Build for Tomorrow, and it sounds like you're pivoting to help Juana, which is good. But let's get into the book. I just loved
yeah.
reading it and looking into it and listening to some of your. It's fun to listen to you, by the way. Um,
Thank you.
but the stories were just great. I think that's what's missing from a lot. That's why this podcast was founded years ago. It was called Reboot Stories, almost a decade
Mm,
ago, and it's all about stories from people who've
yeah.
been there, done that, and from bizarre situations that you might not consider, like from the 1800s. So, and I like the way you've kind of boxed it into, you can go through a panic phase, an adoption phase, kind of like a normalization phase, and there's no going back phase, kind of like burn the boats. So
Yeah.
yeah, tell us about it.
Sure. So the book is called Build for Tomorrow, and thanks for the kind words about it. And as you were describing there, it's the structure of it is that my thesis is everyone goes through change in four phases: panic, adaptation, new normal, wouldn't go back. And the challenge is that you can move through those stages efficiently or not. And the people who I have found to be most successful in business are ones that they don't not panic. They don't not feel the panic, but they tend to use the panic to propel them
Oh
forwards
yeah.
towards what am I missing? What is the new opportunity? Whereas other people use that panic to try to cling to the things that came before. And what I do in the book is lay out a lot of tactics and strategies and then cohere them all into a plan, an action plan that people can use to identify new opportunities in moments of great change. It's primarily focused on work, but it applies to life as well.
Work is good.
And and I wrote it because I have spent years and years and years talking to people about how they built the thing that they did. And what I came to realize is that the common thread among successful entrepreneurs is their ability to be adaptable. And then to the point that you just made about history, I'm absolutely fascinated by history. And I love in particular the history of innovation and the stories that we can learn about why things that today we consider commonplace, the car, the bicycle, the radio, whatever, were in their early days considered scandalous, dangerous, threatening. You can see that pattern repeat itself right now. Just tune into any congressional hearing over technology and you'll hear it. And I think that when we see that pattern in ourselves and in the world around us, and we draw some lessons from what it actually takes to recognize new opportunities and change, we can start to orient ourselves towards progress rather than the panic of losing something we used to have.
Right. Yeah, good point. I've been introduced to many new products and services and companies, but a couple of them were actually fought by the competition, by the big fat
Mm.
slow companies out there that literally would run ads and say, don't do this. Wait till we come out with it. That was back in the hardware days, where you've got examples from everything from margin back in the 1800s to, I think, of cars. It's either offensive or defensive, right? The auto industry lobbied against railroads years ago and kind of try to make it an unfashionable thing just to get people to buy more cars. That's actually more proactive than, but yeah, the whole defense mechanism and pushing back. I think entrepreneurs sometimes some of them are just not ready for that. It's just so disheartening, and it just kind of like demotivates their people. And for me, it's like a badge of honor. It's like, hey, the fact they're paying attention and the fact that there's another competitor now means we're in the right market, right place, right time. Do we have the right
Yeah.
funding and the right team? Is the question. And is it actually going to take off, or are we going to, are we going to be the Yahoo instead of the Google, or who's ever next?
Yeah, and have you structured yourself to respond?
Oh, yeah.
One of the stories that I tell in the book
Yeah.
is, or this was really more of a kind of thought exercise than a story, but came from this guy Hamza Mudassir, is a disruption expert at Cambridge, and
Yep.
he was telling me about this theory of what killed Kodak. Because the traditional story is that the thing that killed Kodak was the digital camera, of course, and of course Kodak had a role in the development of the digital camera and then basically shelved it.
Yes, they
And
did.
that's usually the story that we tell. But the interesting thought experiment here is, what if actually the thing that killed Kodak wasn't the digital camera? What if the thing that killed Kodak was Facebook? And here's how you make that argument. When you, if you, I mean, look, we're we're both old enough to remember early digital cameras. They were terrible. They,
Awful.
they were they were
Yep.
they were awful. Right? They were, the quality of the photo was incredibly grainy. The memory capacity was very low, and it was not clear at all what to do with
It
these
was, yeah,
things.
it was like the slide ruler versus the, calculator. It was hard to use too.
Yeah, it was totally hard to use, and they were ugly and they were bulky, and so it wasn't clear at all that this was going to be the technology that supplanted camera film. And then Facebook. Facebook was really the first major use case for the digital camera, or rather digital photo, because now people were able to see, oh, I can store and organize my digital photos. I can share my digital photos. This is something to do with my digital photos. And it finally gave a purpose to these terrible digital cameras. And at that point, Kodak was unable to respond. And the thing that I think was really fascinating about thinking about this way is that the reason Kodak wasn't able to respond at that moment is because Kodak misunderstood what business it was in. It
Exactly.
thought of itself as being in the camera film business. And therefore, it structured itself in a way to react to competition from within the camera film industry by being faster, better, and cheaper at creating camera film. But the problem is that they were really, this whole time, in the memory business, in the business of helping people capture and share memories. And had they been thinking about it that way, then they might have seen Friendster and MySpace, which preceded Facebook, and say, this is a very interesting innovation inside the memory sharing space. And we should probably get involved in it. And we certainly have the resources to be able to build something great, right? You don't have to sit around and wait for some college dropout to figure it out. And they could have absolutely defined a category, but they didn't, because they were too narrow in understanding the business that they were in, and they hadn't structured themselves to respond to disruption that was outside of their very linear idea of what they did.
Yeah, not to mention a insular culture up in New York there that was tough. That's it's a great story, and I see many companies still in that box. We all get in that box, especially when you get
Mm-hmm.
to a certain size, a certain scope, or whatever. But that whole and consultants come in and talk about product extensions and jumping into new things, and they're all scary boxes for them, right? But it's
Yeah.
I think that's the best lesson is you just need to redefine where the heck you are and who you are and what where. To me, it's more about where consumers are going, but even Steve Jobs would admit it. It's like they don't know. So we're going to have to make it up and do some good, testing and ethnography and without getting too
Right.
geeky, kind of blend it together. But yeah. And so the book's great. The other thing I love that you guys were doing is the whole elevator pitch. I think you're on season 8. It's entrepreneurial elevator
That
pitch.
sounds right.
It's What's that all about? Is it really helping entrepreneurs? Like some of these shows, and I've done a couple where I'm like, the judge and giving out money and stuff. Some of them help. Some of them are, a little bit of a show. This one
Mm-hmm.
seems like a little bit of both. But yeah, just curious what kind of wake you're leaving in that and how it's going.
So, Elevator Pitch, for those who don't know, is a show. It's currently a streaming show produced by Entrepreneur, and it is Shark Tank like. To be frank, the spin that we have on it is that there's a very strong emphasis on the literal elevator pitch. So, a entrepreneur gets into an elevator, has 60 seconds to make their pitch. There is a boardroom of investors, including some very notable ones. Mark Randolph, the co-founder and first CEO of Netflix, is a regular, and they're watching, and they they vote on whether or not to, at the end of the 60 seconds, let the elevator open and let the entrepreneur come out and further the conversation. But if they're not impressed or they don't hear enough to see that this is going to be worth their time, then they just send the elevator back down and the entrepreneur never even gets the chance to talk. And it's been a very, very interesting experience. We started 8 seasons ago, not knowing what it would become, but we just had a feeling like this was something that our audience would be interested in, and that also it was a good way to capture what those conversations are like, obviously with an entertainment spin and the fast moving cameras and everything. But I think that the thing that I hope that entrepreneurs take away from watching it is the incredible importance of figuring out what matters to somebody else when you're talking about yourself. Because
Exactly.
so many entrepreneurs get into that elevator and they just don't even know where to stop and start.
Too
And I
many
get
too
it.
many keywords, I call it. It's just
Too
crazy.
many keywords, yeah. But and I get it because this is what you spend all your time thinking about, and so how can you possibly distill it down into 60 seconds? But the thing is that you have to, and you have to be able to explain yourself as an opportunity for somebody else. That is a critical turn. You are not just walking around looking for somebody to hand out an opportunity for you. You have to be an opportunity to somebody else, which is of course the whole purpose of sitting down with an investor, is that you're not asking them for money. You're showing them that you can make them money. And so the ones who do that really well, of course, are the ones who succeed. The show's been a great success for us. It
Yep.
has a very large audience. It's been financially successful for Entrepreneur in terms of sponsorships and everything.
Yeah.
And we're having a lot of interesting conversations now about where it goes next.
Yeah. Got some ideas for it. I actually show it to some of my Kellogg students. I mean, I'm just really
Oh, that's great.
I'm passionate about this topic. That's why I brought it up. So it's kind of self-serving here because as kind of a reboot guy, turnaround guy going into companies, I literally will do the elevator exercise on the elevator, even before your show. But this is great advice you're giving to people. It's not just the CEO. If you've got more than 2 or 3 employees, people do not know how to pitch their own company, and they all have
Yeah.
to get on the same page. I've seen this in startups where I'm like CEO or chairman, up to definitely large companies, because you can't explain what HP does right now. And it is
Mm.
the most inarticulate thing or diverse thing you've ever seen. And but
Yeah.
especially if you're pitching, and the importance of the elevator pitch at a fundraising event is usually what the focus is, but it's not. It's the whole why do you exist thing, and make it exciting.
You know,
Doesn't have to be a minute, but it would help.
It would help. I have a whole chapter in my book dedicated to a concept that I call the bridge of
That's why I
familiarity.
brought it up. Yeah,
And
yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, and the bridge of familiarity is, and there's, I tell a lot of stories that illustrate it, but the bridge of familiarity is basically remembering that the greatest challenge for a change maker, for somebody who is an innovator, championing something new, trying to convince someone else to make a change, is that you are so familiar with the value of the thing that you made that you forget that it doesn't make any sense to somebody else. And the way that you're going to win them over is not to just convince them of the greatness of what you have and why they should abandon the thing that they're familiar with, because people don't like new things. What people like are better versions of old things. So what you need to
Exactly.
do is start with an understanding of what are they familiar and comfortable with, and then start to build a bridge from them to you. You've got to use their language. You've got to be crystal clear about what they do and how the thing that you made can be an upgrade to something that they already have. Nobody ever wants you to show up and say, stop doing that thing. I have a different way. People hate that. But people are very happy for, I have a much better way for you to do that thing that you like, but that could be better.
Exactly. One of the companies I was chairman of, we sold to Salesforce, user experience design, and it's just as table stakes now. But many people inside the company don't understand that. They don't get the
Mm.
whole. Even with the NSF, I do coaching with teams that have gotten received tens of millions of dollars. We've given away hundreds of millions of dollars. They're primarily university professors, and getting them to go out and do ethnography with people. I know big words, sorry, but it's just amazing. But then I show them, like your video, I show them what consumers want, I show them what I'm like, eventually you're basically making a company here, guys. Make sure it's on track. It's a very foreign concept. And the bigger the company, it seems like the worse it gets. And speaking of worse, really appreciate you being on, but any parting words of wisdom for people that need to get out and get into more of an entrepreneurial mindset, whether they're in a big company or a government institution or gosh knows where?
Sure. Well, I'll share with you one of my favorite pieces of advice that was given to me, and it doesn't hurt that it's also very name droppy. So because uh, I am the editor of Entrepreneur, I get to talk to some pretty impressive people. And not long ago, I was interviewing Ryan Reynolds for the cover of the magazine. And
Yeah, he's
Ryan, in
great.
addition to being obviously very successful actor, but then he started a advertising agency called Maximum Effort that's been incredibly successful, and took ownership stakes in a whole bunch of different companies, Mint Mobile, Aviation Gym. And so we were talking about that transition and what that was like for him, because he was just an actor. He didn't have any business experience. And he said to me this thing that I have been repeating almost daily ever since, which was, to be good at something, you have to be willing to be bad. And I adore that, because I think we too often, think that the difference maker is whether or not we are able to be good at something early, whether we can pick something up and then repeat what quality looks like when we see it in others.
Exactly.
But of course, that's just unrealistic. The better way to think about it is that the difference maker is that successful people are able to tolerate being bad long enough to get to good, and everyone else quits. So if you are feeling stuck, or if you are seeing some kind of change coming, if you feel like something new is on the horizon for you, whether you're an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur, I would take Ryan's words to heart, because it will not be easy at first, but the victory comes by being willing to be bad for long
I
enough.
love it. Buckle up, be bad. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, sorry. Can I just say, I'm just going to say one
Please.
other last
Yeah.
thing, which is just that the book is on Audible. People always ask me. So anyway,
Oh, yeah.
Build for Tomorrow. Please check it out. But hardcover, Audible, ebook.
I would say
Anyway,
it's
thank you so
available
much.
everywhere, like our podcast. But yeah, absolutely. Check out the book, everyone. So you've been listening to Jason Feifer, who is the chief of Entrepreneur Magazine, editor-in-chief at this point. But he's large and in charge there. Many of you read it as well. So I want to thank you for joining us today. This is Dean Tobias with the Reboot Chronicles, and we'll see you soon.